Okay, so in this podcast, I'm going to explain the difference between what I like to call swipers and gulpers and how these two key concepts of sport fish can apply to basically any sport fish out there. So, when I let me start the story. So, a couple years ago, I was on a sport boat out of LA and we had a pretty good bite. And it wasn't yellowtail or anything, but we were getting these small barracudas and I was throwing a hard jerk bait, kind of like this one, or some people know it as a rip bait, twitch bait, all the same thing. Something similar color, a little bit of flash bait fish imitation, and I was doing a retrieve we do, which is a couple winds, pause, couple winds, pause, couple winds, pause. And then basically what happened was there were these small barracuda. They would come up. You would have sometimes you would either get one that would just commit and you'd feel it and you just reel into him, or what would happen is you would do that same retrieve. You would get a barracuda that would follow up your bait all the way to the boat. And literally at the boat, that barracuda wouldn't be the one that would hit, but the one 20, 30 feet under it come out of nowhere will come up and smack your hard bait, and that's the one you'd hook. And the reason for it is that is a concept I like to call swipers. Now, let me clarify. These aren't like actual fishing terms, but I kind of use to describe different kinds of sport fish. So, or different behaviors of sport fish. So a swiper is a kind of fish that basically will take something from afar, will key in on little cues of a prey item, be it like a mackerel, a squid, whatever it may be, a crayfish, and then quickly run up to it, grab it in one quick motion. Hence why it's called a swipe. It's just one quick jab. And for any angler who's been on the water, we know that when we look for bait fish or signs of bait fish, sometimes it's just a little glimmer or a couple of little glimmers of a school of bait fish in the distance, and that's it. You probably have seen this like when you're looking for like really small bait fish that are 10, 20 feet away. And then you can only imagine the same thing as for sport fish. I don't care whether it's a barracuda, a bonita, they're all looking for the same thing. So they're just looking for those faint cues that they're used to. They lock onto it and they go 0 to 100 and they smack it. So that is what a swiper is in short. And basically with that in mind, a swiper, you're going to throw certain kinds of baits that will go inside with it. And that is in certain scenarios where they're actively feeding. So like a school of bait fish. And sometimes it's certain species will just constantly be in that mode of just being a swiper. And one thing you should know for sure is flash. Like we were saying, the flash that a bait fish will give off is the same kind of flash you'll have that you'll have on your lure. So you have that faint flash, hence why in these scenarios, guys like to throw like crocodiles, metal jigs, flashy jerk baits move really quickly, or that are moving really quickly, and other just reaction baits. But if you're a largemouth angler, you probably try throwing a spinner bait or like a war blade, where you're fishing in one spot, but you may get a fish that will feel like you're full on committing to that, where that's full on committing to it from a different area. Or like when largemouth in the middle of the lake and they're just busting. And then you can get away with throwing a flashy bait. So then on the opposite end of that is gulpers. So this is basically fish. They're going to take their time. They're going to move a lot slower. They're going to just they're going to take their time. They're going to study that bait that you have there. These are fish that will like hunch over something, gulp. So you've probably seen this like largemouth. Like think about every time a largemouth will pick up a jig, a little swim bait on the bottom, a drop shot. I've had a largemouth that will just sit right next to my drop shot, study that thing for about 15 or 20 seconds before it took the bait. And I went by that largemouth when I was bedding multiple times. So that's a good example of a gulper. Something natural, it looks for something up close. It's not looking for that distance to hit something 20, 30 feet away. And it's not willing to commit to it. It's willing to study something this distance away from the mic. So this is the bass, this is the bait you have, or this is the crayfish, whatever it may be. This is the shad, bluegill, I don't care. Whatever sardine, anchovy, a shrimp, whatever it may be, gulper. Another good example of this is I was fishing for specks, and there's this one spot we have where all these trout are keying in on these little shrimp and these little glass minnows right next to, relatively close. And I would go by there with the right size imitation of a hard bait. They would never hit it. Almost never. You may get a couple on a pod when you move it really slowly and you do it right, but that's about it. But you go through there with a plastic imitating the same size as those little bait fish. You go through there with a soft plastic and you will just wreck shop. It is the same concept. Versus if you're trying to key out, if a speck is trying to look for something 20, 30 feet away, it's going off of pure instinct. It's going to come up and smack it. But these specks were looking at something 5 feet away, and therefore they look for something more natural. Calico guys, we like to throw a lot of big swim baits, or we like to throw a lot of swim baits like this. On jig heads, we fish it through the kelp. With that in mind, basically what ends up happening is you have the calicos are sitting in their one little ambush spot in the kelp or in the rock or whatever, and they're looking at your bait going by, and they see it as a decently natural presentation. Versus a calico on a sport boat is looking at it maybe 10, 20 feet away, and they see it by instinct. They just come up and smack it because that's what they're seeing when the guys chum on the back of the boat. So that's just something that's just something to know and have in mind. Some other examples of swipers and gulpers. Now you could take this and now you could use this to your advantage. So how would you want to use this? That's the big question. How can I take those two terms that I just made up and use them to my advantage when selecting lure colors, when targeting different species of fish, and I know what I want to go target? So I'll give you a good example. Say you're fishing. Okay, let's just do bass. Let's just do largemouth bass. We all know this in the States. Say you're fishing for largemouth bass. The bass are slow, they're being methodical, and they're cruising and just happening to look by for something that's coming by them, but they're not ready to commit to it. And they're looking toward baits that are looking like maybe a foot or two away. So if you ever throw like a live bait to a largemouth, you'll see that like the largemouth a foot away or 6 inches away from it will take its time before it commits to eating it. So have that in mind. So in that scenario, you'd want to throw like a soft plastic, a jig, and that would probably sound very similar to what other bass anglers would recommend. On the other end of that, like I said, reaction strikes, when you're trying to get that fish to commit in from a distance, you're going to want something like a flashy jerk bait, a flashy spinner bait, like a flashy topwater, or something that shows off a big profile, has that flash, and has that ability to give off those faint cues from afar. Another example of like faint cues from afar with the swiper mentality, I was fishing in this private lake and there were snakes on the top of the water. This isn't actually a top water, but pretend this is a walking bait. I made that walking bait move quick. Normally in largemouth fishing, you go doom, doom, doom when you're walking the dog. I was doing like this to imitate those snakes. And I realized I was imitating those snakes. And basically, I was getting not only decent fish, but I was getting some of my PBs and some of my best fish for largemouth in the lake. Better than any of that even the gatekeeper has seen. Because what that essentially was the largemouth from a decent distance saw a chance at a big meal and faint cues on that big meal. And he reacted like a swiper would, like a barracuda or bonita would, or a what else? Or like a houndfish, like a ladyfish would from a distance, come up and smack it. That's another one for swipers. A ladyfish quickly moves through your target, bust it, makes a giant bust right next to it because it's cueing on little faint things and commits to it. Now we can go back to the gulper. Now another example of the gulper, which is, say you have, let's see if I can do another one. So I did calico's largemouth, speckled trout, or let's say like redfish. At one time I had a little bucktail and jig, had it toward the bottom, and just had it sit there for a second and let the redfish go right next to it, curl over when you're sight fishing. The redfish was curling over. It was about a 6-pound red too, and I landed it. Curled over, and I figured after 5 or 6 seconds of seeing it curling over, right where my jig was, I let him have it. So he had it. So yeah, so those are some different examples of what I call swipers and gulpers. And once you have that in mind, you essentially will have a much better head of now what lures you need to throw and how you target those sport fish. So catch more fish. Have a good day.